Hey everybody, and welcome to Ask Ed. This is the fourth edition of this. It's connected to my March 2022 podcast entitled Ancient American Drugs. I got 5 questions this time. Let's just get right to them. Question number 1 is from Shar Skirvin. Sure hope I pronounced your name right there. Feel free to correct me. Shar asks, "Hi Ed, my husband and I enjoy your podcasts. I've been recently reading a couple of books about the debate as to how and when people came to the Western Hemisphere. What are your thoughts on this?" Great and timely question. Here we go. Okay, I'm going to guess that one of the books that you've been reading is Jennifer Raff's new book, Origins, A Genetic History of the Americas. Now, I haven't read that whole book, but I have read some reviews, and I've looked over it, and, without having seen the entire book, I take it that her main premise is rejecting the idea that the first humans came from Alaska through an open corridor in the ice as it began to melt down into the middle of the United States. Instead, she wants to say that they came down the Pacific coast. They still came from Asia, but they came down in canoes and along the coasts all the way down to South America, explaining some of the interesting genetic differences when we actually look at that DNA history with modern tools. I agree with her. In fact, I've always thought that ice corridor was a very strained theory trying to explain why people were all over the United States, not just along the coast there. So I don't have any argument against that. I really think that's true, and we all know that as the ice receded, the oceans rose, and that's a very logical reason why we have such little evidence of that trail going down all the way to South America. I think that also we need to be cautious about these genetic studies. They really are very recent, and it, like every other science, is evolving. It seems to me, looking at the development of this genetic information that we're collecting, we're learning new things all the time, and they're getting more and more sophisticated about analyzing the history and evolution of DNA. So I don't think that we've answered the question and this is a fully developed tool yet. I think things are going to change, especially when it comes to evidence around the United States. There's a whole lot of early evidence. She tends to peg around 20,000 years, but just this year, probably well after she finished writing her book, we found those footprints at White Sands were actually dating to 23,000. And that's pretty off the coast. So we still have issues about exactly how and when people filtered into the interiors, not just of North America, but Central America and South America too. There have been decades of archaeological tests that have suggested that we have very, very old dates. Up until now, people have been handedly rejecting them as impossible. We really need to go back and revisit those dates and think about it again. I am very hopeful that genetics is going to give us a new window. It already has, but I think it will continue. Maybe we'll answer some of these questions, but in essence, I would say that our understanding of the migration of humans into the Americas is still evolving, and it's getting older all the time. It's an exciting time to be part of archaeology. Let's see what happens next. Question number 2 is from Nancy Bond, and Nancy asks, "Ed, in your videos and podcasts, you talk about the cultural bias of the Spanish and the effects that it had on the ancient Americas. I wonder, how is cultural bias controlled in the work of archaeologists, particularly when they may live for extended periods of time at locations they explore?" Oh, I love this question, Nancy. Let's talk about it. Hopefully I don't go on too long. Let me start by saying that I believe that objectivity in anthropology is really impossible. Not only is it impossible, but even if we could do it, it would be unproductive. I really fall into that camp. Number one, we come from where we come from. Our cultural perspective cannot be erased from our mind. We see things and process them from the place we're at. But further, if we want to understand what people are doing and why they're doing and what it means to them, we really need to step into that culture. And to think otherwise is arrogant and ethnocentric and ignorant. There are many things that other cultures than your own do that make no sense unless you understand that culture's perspective. Sheely often told me that if I didn't let go of my Western thinking and try to think like a Maya, that I was going to get nowhere. And in that same regard, you asked specifically whether living in a location for a long time affects one's objectivity. I'd say absolutely, and for the better. My years and years of living in Central America taught me all sorts of things about how modern Maya people think, and I think it really informs what I think and how I interpret the artifact record and the evidence of the past. It's really through their eyes that we begin to understand it, and the idea that objectivity is somehow going to help us to understand it without our own cultural biases, that's ridiculous. It's really about getting to know people. And a lot of the things that I bitch about the Spanish are exactly that. That they came in, didn't ask any questions, saw what they saw, interpreted it as what would have happened in their culture, and they got it wrong. And they didn't even think to ask certain questions because they didn't understand the indigenous perspective, their mindset. So, I think it's really the opposite. We should put objectivity away and try to really embrace the culture if we're going to understand it and through it properly represent the people we're talking about. Question number 3 is from Drew Curtis, and Drew asks, is there evidence that any of these products you mentioned were used as trade goods at scale? By that I mean, were any of these widely sought-after products involving large-scale cultivation, warehousing, shipping, and so on? Also, thanks for the first archaeological podcast episode I've ever listened to that referenced butt chugging. Great stuff. Okay, Drew, good questions, and you're welcome for the butt chugging reference, I guess. But let's talk about whether these things were traded and at scale. Okay, so were any of these plant materials produced at a large scale and traded and stored? My basic answer is no. They were for a very limited class of people. They weren't for everybody in society, so they didn't need to make a whole lot. For a lot of them, part of the process was the collecting of them out of nature and using them fresh. So, a curandero would go out and find the plants, communicate with the plants, ask for their help, and then bring them back and imbibe them in whatever way they did. I think the one exception is probably coca. Coca down in South America was recognized as something that kept their gigantic workforce working and not so hungry and strong. So the Inca more and more realized that people that weren't even using coca should, because it made them better workers. And at the end of their empire, they really focused on the Amazon and the eastern slope of the Andes to obtain places where they could grow it in mass. They had tons of storehouses called colcas, and those colcas kept whatever products were being grown and harvested in that area. So, some of them had potatoes, some of them had corn, and almost certainly the colcas that they developed down on the eastern slope of the Andes near the Amazon, those ones probably held coca, and it was distributed throughout the empire. So in that case, yes, there was mass production. And everything else, no, I don't think so. Question number 4 comes from Mark Kohler. Mark says, very interesting and thought-provoking as usual. I was curious if you've seen any connections with these practices and your theory of the Fang deity monotheism. Oh boy, are we going to talk about the Fang deity? I love the Fang deity. Let's do this. Okay, are any of these drugs or plants used in connection to the Fang deity? My theory is absolutely. I think that, as I discussed in the podcast, these plants allowed an opening into the other world. In the case of South America, I suspect or theorize that a lot of the priests of the Fang deity took, in their cases, specifically San Pedro cactus brew, in order to open themselves up. My theory is that a lot of them are acting kind of as the vessel through which the Fang deity enters and affects the material plane. We see a lot of pottery that identifies the Fang deity, humans, sometimes dogs, and San Pedro cactus. Sometimes it's blatant and it's a cactus that's uprooted and floating in the background. Sometimes it's more subtle, where they've got a big pot and then chalices and they're drinking something. No, it's not blood. It's probably San Pedro cactus. So I think in the same way that these plants were seen as a door or a window into the other world, they were also used as allowing people to become a window, to become a vessel or a conduit through which the Fang deity, in the case of the coast of the Andes and around there, it was being used to allow him, or to rather invite him, to become a vessel and enter ceremonies in especially moche contexts. I would bring up that is my theory. That is not true. That's just what Ed thinks after having looked at this stuff for 30 years. So, every good theory is something that should be broken, not validated. And, I do my best. I know I am a huge fan of the Fang deity and my ideas. I'm becoming one of those guys. After you think about an idea for decades, you really begin to fight for it, and you'd hate to see all of that thinking just be discounted in a single piece of evidence. So, just bringing it up. This is my theory. I like it. I think it's strong. I haven't been able to invalidate it. But that's what I think. I think he's connected to specifically the imbibing of San Pedro cactus juice that allowed him to use people as vessels. Our fifth and final question comes from Patty King. Patty asks, when you talked about ancient American drugs the first time, the first thing that came to mind for me, as an herbal, tea, and liquor enthusiast, was Damiana. Peddlers of herbs claim it's been used for many centuries, but I, as a layperson and amateur Googler, have not been able to verify that. What evidence, if any, is there to support ancient use of Damiana? Good one, Patty. I have to admit that I actually didn't know this, so I did some research, because that's part of what I love about this show, that I get the opportunity to research things that I'm interested in. This is definitely one of them. Let's talk about what I found. Okay, final answer. Patty, thanks for this good question. I did not know the answer to this, and I always appreciate an opportunity to look up things like this and learn new things. So I did. I did some research, just like you. I may be a amateur Googler myself. I also have a big library that I looked through. And, I looked for the proof that it had actually been documented being used in pre-Columbian times. Yes, there's a whole lot of websites that talk about anecdotal evidence of people in the past using it, but there was nothing concrete. I looked through all of my Sahagún references, which he's the guy who did a 13-volume series on the Aztecs, and he has a whole book on medicine and medicinal plants. I looked and looked and looked. Didn't find it anywhere. I know today there are all sorts of Damiana-infused mezcals and things, and they say that it was used in ancient times, but Didn't find any proof in Mesoamerica, nor did I find any proof in South America. This plant does grow from southern Texas all the way down into South America, so there was no real reason to look for northern North America or Florida or those areas. The Mississippians, it never grew there, and unless they imported it, we wouldn't see it. I also looked through my sources in South America. I looked through Dobkin de Rios, who's done a lot of work on medicinal plants and hallucinogenic plants down there. Nothing. I looked through some of my chronicle people like Barnabé de Cobo. He talked a lot about medicinal plants. Again, nothing. So I think it falls into one of those categories. I said in the podcast that there are over 100 plants that could be hallucinogenic in the Americas. Only a few of them we really have evidence for. So we can't discount or just say they didn't use it in the past. But if they did, it was small enough and not important enough to be either described to the Spanish at contact or put in any kind of Mesoamerican document. We do have things, especially from the Aztecs, that talk about a number of different trade things and important plants. Nowhere in there. So, your research is right, Patty. It's all hearsay. We have no proof archaeologically. Okay, so that's a wrap on AskEd4. I hope you liked that. I'm getting better and better at this. This was done in fairly short time for me. My learning curve is improving. I did have to do this in the middle of the day. I kind of ran out of time with all of the things I had to do. Hopefully the sound quality is good. I can hear traffic. I can hear people mowing their lawns. My dog scratching at the door to get in. Hopefully this came out well. And, we're evolving. We've got 5 questions this time, which is about the same as we've always gotten. We'll see how many people listen to this. And as you all know, you archaeo heads that are the first people to be listening to me, I'm working on this. I'm looking for things that are good for you and good for me. I worry that, if this does take off and I get 30 questions at a time, I can't just spend 3 hours doing this, and then I'd be dissing people that gave in questions. So I'm still thinking about it. We're going to keep this up through this season, and then in the summer I'll think about other things I might do that are also valuable to you, but don't have the potential to reel out of control and start disappointing people instead of giving you what I'm trying to give you. Again, I love doing this. Thank you for listening, and we'll keep working at it together. Until next month, Ed.